Welcome to the 24th Annual Miami Jewish Film Festival, one of the world's largest and oldest Jewish cultural arts events. We want to thank all of our members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, all of you film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education, SAGE, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support throughout all these years. My name is Dalia Ben David. I am the Israel and Overseas Director at the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. And I'm excited to be moderating a virtual conversation with the director, Jonathan Gruber, and producers Barry Gurland and Rachel Greenberg for the film Upheaval. And they are partnering with this year's festival. Thank you all for joining us today. So welcome everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to get started. So I'm going to toss out this question. I'll start with Rachel. What is it about Menachem Begin that made you want to create a movie about his life?
You know, it's really about a story of a man with moral courage to me. I've always been fascinated by the types of people who you could say really were committed to a cause, to an agenda, and didn't compromise from that. And one of the things I always like to say is that we often we often hear from the president of the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, and he goes into a room and he says, who can name the sixth president of the United States? And trust me, half the people in the room cannot. And here we have a prime minister of Israel who is very under-recognized in the English language world. There was no feature film. As the executive producer behind the film always tells the story, when he was interested in Menachem Begin and learning more about him, he started looking into different films and different mediums to tell his story. And there really wasn't. And asking a lot of Americans and a lot of other Jews around the world, the most attention is with David Ben-Gurion, first prime minister of Israel. You hear a lot about Golda Meir, who was the first female prime minister and an American, and also Yitzhak Rabin. Because of the circumstances. So we really thought this was an opportunity to tell the story of a really complex, complicated man who actually embodied a lot of issues that are really relevant today. He was all about inclusivity and unity and social justice and compromise. You saw that with the peace treaty as well. And I think what's amazing about this film and what Jonathan was able to put together in 87 minutes is not only do you get the biopic of Menachem Begin, you get the history of the founding of Israel. So you're going to get an education about from the Holocaust to the Palestine, to the different factions that were fighting for the founding of the country, and to the politics and the complications and what society looked like among all the Jews in Israel, which led to a lot of what we're seeing today.
Okay, great, thank you. And Barry, what about you? What made you excited about producing a film about Menachem Begin?
Well, I was very excited when Rob Schwartz called me up, who I didn't know, and said someone gave him my name and he was doing a movie. I said, I'm not a movie producer or anything else, but I'll meet you for lunch. And we had lunch together with him and Hertzi, the gentleman who runs the Menachem Begin Center. And one of the things, I've been extremely fortunate. You know that I've been active in Federation, I'm on the board. And many years ago in 1977, I went to Israel on a mission. And that's when Sadat came to meet Begin. And I was very fortunate that I had clearance. So I was actually there in the Benjamin Netanyahu and in Jerusalem watching the flags. I even have shirts that I bought for my children with the two flags on it. But that's not the real reason. The real reason is I admired Menachem Begin primarily because of the way he was raised and his commitment. I guess I call it being a mensch, a person of character, a person who makes his decisions based on what's right, not what's good for him, but what's right. And I think he lived that from the time he was brought up in Brisk to where he was sent away, to when he got to Israel, to when he sent a telegram to the British that they were going to bomb the King David Hotel, which wasn't a hotel, it was an office building at the time. So when I got an opportunity to do this, and I've met, fortunately, from Golda Meir on all the prime ministers, and I always looked up to Menachem Begin, even though he was a lot shorter than I am.
Wow, it sounds like it was really amazing to be in Israel at that time and to be experiencing all of that energy and activity. Begin's life was shaped by some key elements, and key events in his life, whether it was the Holocaust, his extremely Zionist upbringing, and the years that he spent in a Russian prison. How do you feel that these experiences shaped his leadership style? And Jonathan, I'll start with you on that.
Sure. Well, I think that he was unfortunately shaped by anti-Semitism his whole life, whether it was growing up in Brisk or Brest, which is now in Belarus but was in Poland, to being chased by the Nazis and arrested by the Soviets, being a refugee. So that when he became prime minister, there were two things that were most important to him: the safety and security of Israel and the Jewish people, and also to recognize that there were other people who were refugees, and to provide safe haven for them, whether it was Ethiopian Jews or Soviet Jews or even Vietnamese boat people, that say that, yes, we understand what it's like to be on the run and to need a place to have shelter, and that we can provide that for you. And yes, on the anti-Semitism side, we will never have a Holocaust again. As long as I'm in charge, we will make sure to protect the Jewish people. And that those decisions, for good or for bad, the bombing of the Osirak nuclear reactor, clearly the whole world was behind that, even though there were political machinations that said that, oh, you shouldn't have done that, but really, who wants Saddam Hussein to have a nuclear bomb? But when it came to Lebanon, for instance, that did not turn out very well. But I think what also struck me about Menachem Begin is that he took responsibility as a leader for things on his watch, whether they were good or whether they were bad. And that's not often that you see leaders taking responsibility like that. They want all the credit, but they don't want the blame. And that's the kind of story that we wanted to tell. Another thing about his leadership is that he never enriched himself through his position. When he finished with his prime minister position, he had to have people put money together for him to have an apartment in Jerusalem. So those are just a few things, along with everything that Barry and Rachel said about why Menachem Begin is such an important figure in world history.
Right. And not only is he an important figure in world history, but in terms of shaping Israeli society. And as most politicians, people either love you or they hate you. But Menachem Begin was really appealed to the average Israeli. And Rachel, what do you attribute this to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it comes down to similar what Jonathan, to follow up on that. It's really about he never compromised when the dignity of the Jewish people was at stake. And one of those principles was about unity. And to the average people at the time, the Labor Party was in power all those years. And the reason, the people ask us why the movie is called Upheaval, not only does it reflect so many elements of his life, but on election night, the broadcaster announced, this is a mahapach. The Labor Party was no longer in power, and the Likud Party was in power. And he really believed, there's a very famous speech, and you'll see it in the movie as well, where he says, Iraqi, Ashkenazi. He believed that the Ashkenazi Jews from Europe should be treated equally as the Jews coming from North Africa. And at that point, Israel was a huge melting pot, and there was a lot of marginalization going on. And so he had a program where he went into the communities and made sure that it was called Project Renewal. There were 200 communities, and he made sure there was housing and after school programs for the kids, and really tried to bring up portions of the society that were marginalized. And you'll see now, when you go through Machane Yehuda, which is the shuk of the market, either in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, you'll have people work there, have pictures and posters of him, and whether you were Labor or Likud or any party, the way that people talk about him now for his humility, his ability to unite. And a perfect example of this was when he came into power, he actually kept members of the Labor Party within the cabinet and the serving party, because he wanted to have everyone's opinion, and he wanted to take into account the various point of views in the country.
Mm-hmm. And Barry, do you have anything to add about that, his appeal to?
Well,
the
I
general
think
population?
major things. When I was in Israel in 1973, there was really a divide between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardim. And then in 77, when I was there, you could see that divide closing. And I felt tremendous when I saw the Ethiopians getting off the plane and coming there and mingling with them. And all of that was due to Menachem Begin's foresight and his ability to make decisions as to what is right for the people, the Jewish people, not the Sephardic, not the Ashkenazic, not the North Africans or anyone else. A good friend of mine who I spoke to yesterday, he spent 2 weeks or 3 weeks in Egypt prior to Sadat coming to Israel. He was with one of the military aides of Menachem Begin, and the way he spoke about him was unbelievable.
Right. And, Rachel, you mentioned before his social justice and how that was very important to him. And, in that aspect, he started bringing over all the Ethiopians. And we see even as far as last week, where so many more Ethiopians of Jewish descent are being brought into Israel. And we really have him to thank for this over the past 35 years of bringing this community back to Israel and connecting them with the rest of the Jewish people. So, not only was he a Zionist, but he was very connected to and knowledgeable about Judaism. He felt strongly about welcoming the stranger, like Abraham in the Bible welcomed strangers, as well as in the Torah itself, it states, you should also love the stranger, for you are a stranger in the land of Egypt. And we saw with the Ethiopians, we saw also welcoming the Vietnamese refugees. As so many Jews were trying to escape Nazis were turned away. And he felt that because of that experience, we more than anyone, the Jewish people, should have compassion and welcome these refugees to Israel. So on the one hand, you see the social justice moral part of him and this moral obligation and responsibility. At the same time, how do you feel that he was able to reconcile this part of him with the protective of Israel and the fighting part, where you have, his time in the Irgun and what happened there, or during the Lebanese war, where he was criticized by many people? So Jonathan, let's start with you on that.
Sure. So, in terms of reconciling, I think part of what drew me to him as a character was his complexity, and to try and share the nuances of his story, where it's not one straight arc. It's kind of a back and forth. Sure, he, as we said, he brought in all these people who were looking to come to Israel. He also, at the same time, created a terrible situation in Lebanon. So it's important to look at him as a leader who really did the best that he could. But again, as I said before, he took responsibility for what he did, and he stood up for what he felt was important to him. He was a man with principles. With the Irgun, when they were doing their activities, they made sure that there were no civilians involved. It was only against military, against the British military. And I think that's one of the questions. Say, well, isn't he a terrorist or is he a freedom fighter? Some people thought he was both. It's not clear. And these are very hard questions. And I think part of what the goal of this film is to create a conversation around Menachem Begin. Who was he? What is he? What does he stand for? How did he represent Israel's interests or not in some ways? And to take that and have these discussions and have people learn more about Menachem Begin and learn more about the history of Israel, the remarkable history of Israel, where it came from and where it is today.
Thank you. And Barry, what about you in terms of, having two parts of him and being able to reconcile that?
Well, I think that Menachem Begin, again, when he made his decisions, he made it based on his upbringing, based on the Torah and what's right in his mind, and he stuck to it. And when there was a mistake made, he stood up and said, I was wrong. And I think that's very important. And one of the advantages of this film and the tremendous job that Jonathan did is young people, my grandchildren, who didn't have the opportunity to live through Menachem Begin will again see what a man conducted his life based on Torah. He might not have been the most religious person, but he certainly conducted his decision making as any other religious person would.
Those are very good points. And Rachel, because you mentioned before the more positive aspects. So how for you do you think he was able to reconcile all that positive, the Jewish value part of him with the other tougher decision-making part?
No, excellent question. And also to Jonathan's point about the contradictions and the complexities. But one thing that we have to remember, that he wanted the British out of Palestine, right? And one of the main reasons they wanted it was that there were still restrictions on the immigrants. So here you had these Jewish refugees trying to find a safe haven to go. And they were sent away. They were sent to Cyprus. They were sent to prison. They were sent away. And he wanted to find that place. And what was driving him was to have a home, to have a safe haven for Jewish people, where they could defend against others, but they were defensible within their country. And he was a follower of revisionist Zionism. He was a Jabotinsky follower. I think you mentioned earlier too about his youth, how it impacted him. He was one of the Beitar leaders in Eastern Europe. So they did believe on having, Jabotinsky did believe in having a Jewish legion and to fighting back and to having a state. So those were all driving forces behind his actions. For those, when you see the film, and if you've seen the film, when you look at the war in Lebanon, there's questions, and we interviewed people as well who said sometimes he knew before and sometimes he knew after. We don't have him on tape saying exactly what he knew and didn't know, but I do believe, again, he was trying to create those safe borders. And, he had the military there as well, who sometimes took actions, perhaps without seeking his advice. We'll never know 100% for sure. But I believe that he went into Lebanon with the idea of having safe borders and protecting the Israeli inhabitants, and also potentially having a peace with Lebanon. I mean, that was part of the aspirations at the beginning as well.
Mm-hmm. So, I remember growing up the peace treaty with Egypt. So that's something major, that's historical, that I recall. I also recall the Lebanon War, and I have, people that I know that actually fought in the Lebanon War. And so I walked away with learning so much about Menachem Begin's life, and it really pieced together so many disparate elements of his life. And it really put it together nicely in a package where you saw it in a different context, and you saw it both chronologically, historically, and it really brought to me a sense of who he was as a person beyond the politician. And I think that was so important. So I want to know your intent on making this film. What would you want most viewers to walk away with after seeing the film? And Barry, I'll start with you on that.
I think the word is respect. To respect a man like Menachem Begin. And again, hopefully we will be showing this film in schools and all over. And they will be able to have an image to follow, to understand what they have to do in life. I think it gives them a great direction. So, having seen the film, and to me, it meant so much to see how this man lived and what he did. And Jonathan did a great job. And I believe we'll arrange to have this shown in many of the Jewish day schools around the world.
That's great. Hopefully that can happen. And Rachel, what about you? What do you hope that the viewer walks away with after seeing the film?
Well, truthfully, it's about acting with moral courage isn't antiquated. So each of us can aspire to make brave decisions and take responsibility when the results don't go the right way. And, whether you agree with Begin or not, I think most people will agree he wasn't a hypocrite. And he exemplified, I keep saying these words, and I hope I was able to illustrate some of them before, but I really think that he exemplified the values of inclusivity and social justice and unity and compromise. And like we talked about, not just standing up for the dignity of Jews, but standing up for the dignity of all people.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Jonathan, what about you?
So there are two things that I would hope people would come away with, in addition to everything that Barry and Rachel and you said, Dahlia. Number one is resilience, his ability to be in power, but not really be in power for 29 years in the opposition, and to stick to his principles until he became prime minister, to not compromise, whether it was fighting in the Irgun or fighting, in his political party, to stick to it. If someone has something that they truly believe in, to, compromise is helpful sometimes, like, of course, making peace, but sometimes you have to stick to your principles, and he did. And the last thing that I hope people would come away with is a sense of the love that he had for his wife, and that every time that he was in a setting like the night that he won the election, the first thing he does is he thanks his wife and quotes from Jeremiah. They were together, and even though he was the front man, I guess, literally, he always gave credit to his wife for supporting him through the hard times. And when she died, he was a broken man. It just talks about the love that they had for each other. And it was really beautiful to come across that part of his story.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because to me that was extremely moving, and very emotional. And like I said, that's the part of you see the human being and not just the politician, and that's really important. Anybody else have any other last words that they want to share about the film, or something else that they wanted to express in closing?
We're just grateful to have the film at the Miami Jewish Film Festival. It's a great town. I'm actually here for a short period of time in South Florida, so I've been enjoying it. And we hope people get to see the film and share it with others.
We feel the same way. Thank you so much to the director, Jonathan Gruber, and producer, Rachel Greenberg and Barry Gurland from the movie Upheaval, for joining us today. Once again, thank you to all of our members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, all of you film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, for their continued support through all these years. And thank you, our audience, for participating in the 24th Annual Miami Jewish Film Festival.